Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Indeed we are. Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. Yes, we do. This week it's going to be the turn of Laurence Myers, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry, and also his time in music, film, and also his new publication that came out, I think, a year ago, which is titled Hunky Dory, in brackets, who knew? Anyway, working with such people as, the Kinks, Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, and obviously David Bowie and a lot of stuff about Tony DeFries. So I was curious. I wanted to speak to him, so we did. Anyway, look, after several minutes of casual chat, oh yes, just to say, just as a little bit of a thing, he's very excited because he's just been able to book in for his COVID test that he's going to have, or vaccination very soon, so he gets a little bit distracted with his friends contacting him, so that's it. But I'll leave that in because it makes it very current. Anyway, look, Laurence, tell us more about the book and when it all came together now.
Well, I probably decided some years ago that I maybe should do something, and it started off as I understand these things often do, is you do it for your children. Now, who's interested? Well, your children will be interested, and your children's children. And I do like to write. I've never had a lot of time to write, but I do like to write. So I suppose from the time I started in earnest was probably 18 months before it came out, 2 years before it came out.
Right.
And I decided to do it. I mean, mainly because, to be honest, so many people said to me, "You should write it down. You should write it down. It's so interesting, and you should write it down." So I did.
Yes, and was it an emotion? Did you find, was it a surprise when you started to put it together? As in, I mean, having spoken to a few people, they kind of, there's certain subjects that they kind of put to one side, then they pull it out, and then they look at it again, put it, and then they bring it, and they think, I need to deal with this because I've actually not really thought about it because for various reasons.
Well, I think the thing is, I didn't deal with my personal life very much, other than a short history, which I give people permission to skip, because I always do. If I read a biography and it starts telling about what their great grandfather did, I just skip it until I start reading about what they did. So there was nothing in terms of emotion that I felt I don't want to deal with that, because I didn't deal with. Business can be very emotional, and for certain it can be very traumatic. So I just got on with it. And the big decision to me was what to write about, so I decided just write about music, primarily about music. And the reason was that my career in the music business was, if I say so myself, quite illustrious because of who.
Yes. Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, someone tried to call me. I've stopped it.
Oh.
Sorry about that. Yeah, because I dealt with such important people. So it's not that I was so interesting, but the people I dealt with were so interesting. And when I went into film and I went into theatre with sometimes success and sometimes not success, but I wasn't at the heart of it. I wasn't dealing, in film, I wasn't dealing with, the biggest film stars in the world and the biggest directors in the world and the biggest writers in the world. And in fact, so really my knowledge of the music business, I think, is rather special. And I decided to stop there. Otherwise the book would have gone on for a long, long time, too long.
Yeah, because you're, obviously this is kind of to do with really you were there at the very sort of almost the birth of what we now know as popular music, rock and roll, whatever. Yeah. And actually, the interesting thing is that there isn't anything particularly before that to look back and go, oh, what did they do? What do I need to do to avoid these pitfalls? So how did you manage to do such an amazing amount of navigating, kind of almost kind of pioneering?
Well, it sort of fell into my lap in a way. I always loved music of all sorts, and I love pop music, and I love most of the music of the day. And when I was 16, I talk about it in my book. My mother said, what do you want to do? What I wanted to do, I wanted to be a Latin American percussionist, but that would have been the end of my life because she would have killed me where I stood. So I said, I won't be that. And she gave me, the Jewish mother's list of things that you can do. And it was doctor, dentist, blah, blah, blah. And the accountant was the last one. I said, I'll be that. So at the age of 16, I got articles, which is what you did in those days. You got sort of apprentice articles for the princely sum of 15 shillings a week, 75p a week, which even in the olden days was not a lot of money. And I hated it, and I wasn't interested in it. And I failed my exams a couple of times, and eventually I qualified as a chartered accountant. I was articled to a very tiny firm I had very little experience and I had very little interest. And I thought I'll never get a job. I wouldn't hold a job down because I wasn't good enough. So what I did is I went into business on my own. I found another guy who I had known over the years who qualified, a very nice guy called Ellis Goodman. We went into business together, and we got somebody in the music business as a client, a guy called Mickey Most.
Right.
And I just grabbed him. I said to Ellis, Ellis had the connection. He'd met the guy. He'd met a guy on a plane who was going to finance Mickey Most, and I knew who Mickey Most was. I bought House of the Rising Sun, So I said to Ellis, look, I'll deal with him. And that's what got me into the music business, because it was booming. It was absolutely booming. It wasn't a new business, but it was a new business in terms of people bursting onto the scene. Yeah. Previously, the record business was usually capturing 3 minutes of a very well-known star. Somebody was a star of films or radio, and they would make a record. But suddenly, radio is what did it. If you could get a song played on the radio, kids would buy it, and so a star could be made out of getting radio play for a new record, and that's what was new.
Yes,
that's really what was new.
And I was going to say, I mean, did you sort of find yourself having to really play catch up very quickly? Because obviously a lot of this, there's big money involved and some really quite amazing characters. Because obviously Mickey Most, you had his zeitgeist moment, didn't he? And then suddenly falls off. Yeah. But then you do work with some other heavyweights, and with most things in life, you have a certain innocence until one day something comes along and whacks you quite badly, and you get floored. Did you have any of those kind of moments in those early years?
Well, because it was all very new, there was, I was an accountant. That's how I got into the business, and there were no go-to accountants for the music business, because the music business was sort of old world and not full of young people looking for accountants. So, and I got on with them very well. So through Mickey was recording the Animals and Herman's Hermits and Donovan. I met them. I met other people. I went to Mid-End with Mickey, went here, went there, met other people. Oh my God, you're an accountant. I was I don't know, about 26 years old. And I'd given my home number and I knew about them, so they could relate to me. So suddenly I was getting all of these mainly young people who suddenly were about to earn a lot of money that needed an accountant. And it's what happened. Musicians all seem to go to the same doctor, to the same the same therapist, whatever. And I was the accountant.
Yes, I know. There is.
Then after 5 years of accountancy, which I did not enjoy, and I felt very restricted, because in those days, professional etiquette in accountancy, you couldn't go after clients. You couldn't say, look, let me represent you. You had to wait to be approached. And then you had to write to the old accountant and say, is there any reason why I shouldn't approach him. And I found that very frustrating. So in 1970, I had established myself as someone well known in the business because I'd represented the Rolling Stones, Zeppelin, Animals, and on my side of the business, you are as important as whoever you represent.
Yes, absolutely.
So
I was going to say, but the characters you met and worked with, these are the heavyweights, aren't they? They're the legendary managers that go down in like the gangster managers, really, of bands, really, like Don Arden. So I mean, what was, you're under 30, you've probably been around a few times, but not a lot. So you meet someone like Don. What was that kind of experience like for you?
Well, I'm from Finsbury Park, so I didn't go to. I wasn't educated in the Gilded Cage. I was educated in Holloway, and my parents, we had a sweet shop, and everybody used to come in, and some of them every now and one would say to my father, "Jerry, would you mind holding this parcel for me?" And it would be a gun or something. My father would say, "I'd rather not." So I was aware, not part of, but I was aware that there is a seamier side of life. So none of these things, meeting Don Arden, and Don Arden was a caricature. He was a wonderful character, and I mean, he was a bit of a gangster. He and a guy called Patrick Meehan, before my time, used to have physical fights over who was going to manage various artists. But it didn't faze me. For whatever reason, it didn't faze me.
Yes, that's quite amazing, isn't it? And one thing I've noticed with a lot of people, in the world of entertainment, they normally have kind of a 5-year period where they're on that kind of moment. I suppose the zeitgeist moment, but they don't manage to keep it going. They sort of take their eye off the ball, or they just get tired.
Well, I think that's true. I think it's true of me. I had 5 years as an accountant where I represented some of the biggest names in the business. And I then went into the business in 1970. I started a production company because I was so well known as a representative of artists. I got a deal with a record company who gave me enough money to fund a record production company. And the first record I put out was Love Grows, Where My Rosemary Goes, which was a huge #1 hit. And
yes.
I left practice because I was I was the accountant, apart from Mickey Mouse, I was the accountant to Tony McCauley, a very, very successful writer-producer, and Mike Leander, a very successful writer-producer. So I did a deal with a record company for those two, for the product of those two. And the record company, Bell Records, gave me the money to do that. And Tony McCauley did the first record, which was a huge hit. And after, they started coming. And then because I was still basking, if you like, in the sorry, David, but this COVID thing is all my friends now calling me, asking me how I did it. I was still basking in the reflected glory of these, the major artists that I dealt with, and also I was becoming very successful as a production.
Yes, absolutely.
Company. And then I did a deal. I didn't think I hadn't had skills of management, on-hands management. I was very good and very comfortable making record deals and making deals. So I did a deal. I brought in a guy called David Joseph, who brought with him the New Seekers, who he was managing very successfully. So I had the New Seekers. I had these records I made that were becoming hits. And then in walked Mr. Bowie.
Yes, which is kind of quite an amazing period, isn't it? Because I've done an interview with dear old Angie, and taught, and Bowie was, I confess, was my first love, my first single, and that was a great one because it could have been Gary Glitter, which wouldn't have been so brilliant. So I stuck with Bowie, but then
I had Gary Glitter as well,
Oh, you had Gary Glitter. Well, in a way, he was the star, wasn't he? Let's face it.
He was. I have to point out, as I point out very strenuously in my book, because it's very important to me, because I had huge success with Gary, huge success. He bought my house, but it was 20 years before he was revealed to be, just a totally unacceptable, vile person.
Yes.
So I had Gary, who was being a huge success, and I had the Edison Lighthouse, and then a guy called Tony DeFries brought David Bowie to see me. David Bowie was not successful. He had not had any success. He had one album out, The Man Who Sold the World. It was not a success. And Mercury spent quite a lot of money on it, and it was not a success. So the record industry were not particularly keen on signing him. So I signed him. I brought Tony DeFries in. I signed him. I signed David for management, and which you could in those days. You couldn't do it now, quite rightly. I signed him for management and publishing and records. And sorry, this is going to keep on happening. I'm sorry about that.
No,
I don't know what to do. I don't know how to deal with it, other than just keep declining. People will think I'm being very rude. So, yes. So I forgot where I was.
Yes, well, with David, Tony and David.
Oh yeah.
So what made you want to sign them? Because Bowie's 60s
I wanted to sign David because a year before I had gone to the Ivor Novello Awards, I think with Tony McCauley, who won Best Songwriter of the Year. And David had made a record called Space Oddity. And I thought it was bloody wonderful. And what I liked about it, so I bought the record, The Man Who Sold It, even though it wasn't successful. And what I liked about David was two things. He didn't always write love songs. He didn't write songs, which everybody did, even the Beatles, almost every song was a love song in some form or other. And David didn't. And the other thing is he sang in an English accent, which I quite liked because, like the Animals, in the studio, they sounded like they were from the Mississippi Delta, but when you spoke to them, they were from Newcastle. And they suddenly change. Nothing wrong with it, but it was just, anyway, that's why I like the Kinks also for that reason. I like Ray Davies for that reason. He sang in a London accent. He was a London boy, and he wrote about London things.
Yes. So with the Bowie gang, because it's kind of interesting, because he wasn't going anywhere particularly well, especially in the sort of 60s.
No. What happened is I paid, which was a huge risk for me. I wasn't a big company. I was Laurence Myers. I had a wife, 3 kids, and a mortgage, and I paid for him to make 7 songs, which essentially were Hunky Dory, became Hunky Dory, and with that acetate, a famous Bowie promo, which is now worth a fortune. I, of course, threw all mine away. Who knew? I got to deal with RCA. But if I wouldn't have put the money up, we would not have got a record deal, because no one was interested in David until I provided David with essentially what was going to be Hunky Dory. And people listened to that and they said, wow, we'll sign him. It wasn't easy. There was not a line of people.
Well, I know. And what was kind of boggling was that, the stuff that David was releasing in the 60s, I often find myself wondering, why he was recording it, because, you think it was the Beatles, Stones, the Kinks, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, and then his kind of work, but you'd have thought, interesting. So you would have never put any money on this character to have sort of come from his kind of slightly Anthony Newley world into this kind of amazing kind of futuristic kind of rock world, which had never been done before, which I think that's why I'm sort of interested how you could spot something. Was it his
first of all, I happen to be obsessed with Anthony Newley. He did sing like Anthony Newley.
No.
I loved Anthony Newley. If I could have managed, forget the Rolling Stones, Bowie, forget everybody. If I could have managed Anthony Newley, I wouldn't have made the money, but I'd have been a very happy guy. I was just his hugest fan. And I did actually have some business dealings with him in later years, but sadly, he was by then quite ill, and then he died. So I think the big thing with David about all of this is that it's now a historical interest and remarkable, but then it wasn't. I called my book "Who Knew?" because as I was writing it, I kept saying, "Who knew?" I had a meeting with Mick Jagger when I was his accountant, and at one point, every pensions came up, and he said, "Well, maybe I should think about it, Laurence. After all, Laurence, I'm not going to be singing rock and roll when I'm 70." And we laughed at the thought,
Yes.
And it was who knew all these things were happening. I mean, I thought, babe, I really signed David. My big thing was songwriters. I signed Tony McCauley and Mike Leander because they were great songwriters. I love songwriters. And I thought David was a very good songwriter. The first time I actually saw him in Aylesbury, after I signed him, I went to Aylesbury to see him. There was about 300 people in the room. He was very uninspiring. He sort of stood there flapping his arms about, singing his songs, very poor reception. But he was a great songwriter. That's why I signed him. And then, of course, he went into character. His mime background, his natural theatricality that he had came in. And once he went into character and he went out on stage, well, different world.
Yes. I know. It was kind of Angie and Tony DeFries, really, wasn't it? And Main Man, the whole sort of, Cherry Vanilla and that gang helped to elevate.
Well, that was afterwards. What happened was David was actually signed to my company, Gem, and Tony DeFries, who brought David to me, was actually an employee of Gem. And then it was decided that David should go and live in America and work in America because he wanted to break America, which is very important. And he had an American wife, so that gave him, he could work there. So Tony said, "Why don't we open an American office and I'll run it?" And I said, "No, you open an American office. I financed the opening of the office, and I did a deal whereby I got a share of the gross income from all the artists that were signed to my company, signed to Gem. I assigned to Main Man, and that was DeFries, Dana, Mott the Hoople, and a whole load of others. And then at a point in time, Tony said to me, it was very, very amicable. Tony said to me, I should point out that when they were in my office, and I had all these weird things going on in my office. I had the New Seekers sort of office department, and they were all stand there, smile, clean your teeth, look, singing harmony. I had Gary, who actually was a bloke, a very blokey bloke, Gary. He liked to go fishing, liked to go have a beer. And then I had the Bowie. And it was somewhat schizophrenic for me. I would go from one to the other and have to sort of change my character to blend in. And the Bowie, the expense of Bowie was getting out of hand. And I knew I couldn't control it. And I was finding it hard to control it in London. I would never have been able to control it in America. So I did a deal. I assigned the masters of the reversion. My deal with RCA was the Hunky Dory, Ziggy Stardust, anything I gave them would revert to me after 5 years. And I assigned that to Tony, who he told me had a 50-50 deal with David. I did question that. He said, because Colonel Parker had a 50-50 deal. I said, but Colonel Parker had one client, Elvis Presley. So that was easier. How are you going to do a 50-50 deal if you've got all these other things going on? It wasn't, he said, don't worry about it. It wasn't my business. And at a point in time, Tony said to me, you're taking share of the gross, which is quite, he said it's quite deserved. He said, but it's sort of hard. Is there a point in time? Is there a sum of money which you will, release your interest and your control? At that time, I was in, or David Bowie was into me for about £70,000. This is 1970, which is what today? £500,000 today. I mean, as I say, I was not a big multi-company. I was just a guy who started a record company. He started a business. So I said, I want my money back. And I said, and it was an arbitrary figure, really. I said, because I thought I'd never do it. If I could earn, say, £500,000 in the next 3 years, you're free. And he did. So
Yes.
Tony paid me off, and I had no longer had any interest, financial interest. But I had done very well out of it, and I was perfectly happy.
Which is good. Which is good. And how did you? I mean, obviously, that's kind of great, feeling of being kind of clean with the sort of the break. And then when you've had that kind of experience, then how do you sort of not so pick yourself up, but sort of then look for the next challenge? I mean,
well, it wasn't so much picking myself up. It was this huge relief. I mean, I had an awful lot on the line with David Bowie, and to get a huge check for the equivalent today, what, £5 million or something today? It was just like, that will do. Thank you very much. My house will not now disappear to bailiffs, and it was it was just a huge relief. And I had such a lot of other things going on. I had my production deal with Bell, which was doing very, very well. Glitter was doing extraordinarily well. The New Seekers was doing extraordinarily well. And I started a company called Arcade Records, which was the invention of the compilation business. It had not existed.
yes,
I invented it.
the compilation.
Because of my strength with the record companies, I persuaded them it was a very good thing to do. And there was all sorts of problems because I go into it in some detail in the book because it is quite complicated. But I had to persuade them to go to a lot of trouble and overcome all sorts of complications to allow all the various record companies to all give me their singles, their hits, to put on my Arcade label. But I did it, and that was probably the most financially successful deal I ever did.
Yes, which is incredible. So, because just fast forwarding slightly from that, I mean, theatre seems to be a very risky business to try and get into. So, what made you suddenly feel like, yes, I might have a little...
Well, I'll tell you why, because Mike Leander wrote the score to a musical called Matador. Okay?
Yes.
Mike Leander wrote the score. He went up, he'd made a lot of money out of Gary Glitter, a lot of money. He went off to live in Spain and got involved in Spanish culture. And he came to me one day and said, listen to this. And he'd written this unbelievable musical score for a musical about El Cordobés, who was a very famous 50s bullfighter. And I said, well, I don't know anything about producing theatre. I'll find a producer. And I couldn't. I phoned Don Black, the lovely Don Black, who had bridged over from pop music to theatre. He was a very successful lyricist in the world of theatre. And I said to Don, I'm looking for a producer for a musical. And he said, we all are. There aren't any. There's only one, Cameron McIntosh, and he's busy. So to cut a long story short, he's very funny, Don. I said, if you call me back if you think of anyone. And 2 minutes later, the phone rang, and he said, write down Laurence Myers. So he said, you could do it. He said, you could do it. So, and he'd been working on a musical with Adam Faith. He wanted to do Alfie as a musical. And as it turned out, we couldn't do that. Hello?
Yes.
We couldn't do Alfie's musicals. The rights weren't available, so we did Budgie. So the first thing I ever did in theatre was to produce a West End musical, which is a bit like saying, I wouldn't mind being a doctor, so I'd do a bit of brain surgery, see if I like it. And that failed, but I was in the business.
Yes, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, because some of the things that you picked, and one of my favourite plays was the Geoffrey Bernardi's Unwell. I mean, obviously, when you see something like that coming onto your desk, you don't think this is going to be an amazing sort of winner in terms...
Well, yeah, you did, because it had been a huge hit. And what happened was that Peter O'Toole, it was his favourite thing he'd ever done in theatre. He'd ever done in his life, actually. And he wanted it recorded for his son. He didn't want it recorded. So he was brought to me and he said, look, I just want to do it and we'll record it. I'll do it for a week and record it. So I said, no, it doesn't work. And eventually I persuaded him to do 9 weeks. And the only doubt was because he had not been in the limelight or not been working very much, was everybody was a bit worried whether or not, and he had this roue reputation of being a wild man drinker, etc. Anyway, so the bookings were quite good. And then after the first review came out, we sold every ticket to every performance within a week. It was unbelievable. And he was unbelievable, and it is unbelievable.
Yes, absolutely.
The BBC filmed it, and I'm trying to persuade the BBC to put it out again.
Well, they should have done it for Christmas. I mean, with your looking back, I mean, obviously, have there been any kind of moments where you think, God, that was a really tough year, or that was a bit of a disastrous period of my life?
Oh, I mean, every month, if not every week. It's a very up and down business. The world of entertainment.
Yes, but you obviously kept in it, and you didn't sort of let it beat you. And at the same time, your success rate is quite, from the outside, it is extraordinary. So I just wondered how you can manage to sometimes sleep at night, knowing so many conversations and so many.
Well, of course, I don't. In my book, I don't talk a lot about my failures. I do mention them, but one dwells more on the success. I mean, the people I turned down. I turned down Queen. I turned down an awful lot of people that I can't go into it now.
No.
Someone. It's in the book, and I encourage people to buy it because it's entertaining.
It's very entertaining. Well, I have to say, Laurence, it's been brilliant, and it's so great that I have to say that with Dana Gillespie and yourself and all these other books. I mean, what I think is so good is that it kind of adds to those stories that we know and the narrative, but it's only one part of it. So knowing more about the main man and Tony DeFries, and then your relationship and what you did, kind of adds to this narrative. Because, to be honest,
I hope so.
Because I think that's the kind of thing that I find kind of fascinating. Because when you dig down, you start going, oh, okay, David wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been there, and then Tony hadn't been there. But then it needed Angie as well to sort of say,
yeah, absolutely. Angie is underrated.
Yes,
in importance.
Well, I think it was quite interesting because I guess you would have gone to the David Bowie exhibition, David Bowie Years at the V&A, and it was interesting in the sense that for me, I realised her not being in it, or probably Tony DeFries, kind of.
I didn't go to the exhibition. I probably paid for most of the clothes, so I'd already seen them.
And when was the last time the last time you had a kind of any conversation with David? Was during that period in the 70s, or did you?
No. It was all very fine, and then he and DeFries fell out big time. And I tried. RCA came to me and said, "You're probably the only person that can bring them together. Can you try?" And there was a very famous, huge meeting in LA, which considerable cost of which was covered by RCA, where we had a huge suite at this hotel, and there was David and his then manager, Michael Littman, who I knew well, in one room, and there was DeFries in another room, and there was RCA and myself sort of in a middle room. And there was a big sort of living area, and I summed them both, and I said, "Look, all you guys have ever done is make money for me, and you're not putting out records, and it doesn't matter who you are. Believe me, if you do not put records out, your public will go and buy records by somebody else, and you will fade. You have to put records out." So that was my last proper meeting, and that didn't go particularly well. Because Michael Littman came to me and said, "Look, because I knew him, Michael." He said, "Look, this is really, really embarrassing." But and he was very hesitant to say it, but he said it. "David would like you to sign something to say you're not getting any money out of this." And I just said, "You tell David to go fuck himself." Because I was furious. I mean, I'd gone through a huge amount of trouble. I devoted a week of my life. And I did see David after that, but by now, he associated me so much with DeFries, who he hated, that he was not warm to me at all. Andy still was. Andy was very appreciative of what I'd done.
Yes. Were you absolutely flabbergasted when we'd been whispered that kind of message? Had you not expected that?
No, I hadn't. I'd expected a little message saying thank you very much. I deserved a message saying thank you very much. There was nothing in it for me. Nothing in it.
Were you surprised that Michael hadn't said to him, actually, that's a bit of a crap thing to say?
I think he possibly did, because he was very hesitant. He was very apologetic. I don't know what went on between Michael Littman and David, but that's how and then it all broke up anyway. And they didn't come to reconciliation. They did about 3 months later.
Yeah. I know, it's kind of it's kind of an extraordinary story, and I guess you're probably thinking, that's an amazing part. That must have been one of those amazing meetings to have been part of, and to see this kind of period in sort of rock history.
Well, yeah, I had a very interesting episode with Stevie Wonder, which who I almost managed. He came to us and wanted me to manage him. It's a long story, and I am plugging the book, but it's in the book. Hunky Dory, Who Knew, Laurence Myers.
Yes. And that was me in conversation with Laurence Myers, talking about his new book and life in, entertainment, music, film, theatre. There you go. The book is titled Hunky Dory, in brackets, Who Knew. Buy it. It's a classic. Anyway, this has been David Eastaugh, the C86 Show. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, do C86 Show. And also, these have all been archived, and you can get those Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Check them out. They might just change your life. Bye.